It's Lucy Litch, and this is Tiny House Conversations. It's the Australian-based podcast where I interview experienced tiny houses, tiny builders, and adventurers in the tiny world so you can discover how to create, build, and transition into tiny life. So you want to go tiny, but you might be wondering, where can I park my tiny house? I want to let you know that I have a special unreleased podcast episode of tiny house parking success stories from other tiny houses who were just like you and who have easily managed to find a long-term parking space for their tiny home. Some of them have even found more than one space. So if you want ideas on finding a parking space for your tiny, you can download this episode for free. To get access to it, head over to tinyhouseconversations.com/tiny parking. If you enter your details there, I'll send it straight to your inbox. Now let's intro today's episode. Hey, it's Lucy and welcome back to Tiny House Conversations. Joining me on the show today is Amie Skilton, who is a naturopath, nutritionist, herbalist, and a qualified mould testing technician, just to name a few things. As a former functional medicine practitioner of 18 years, Amie's view of root cause medicine was forever altered as a result of an environmentally acquired illness. In 2017, after developing CIRS herself, also known as Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, Amie discovered the world of building biology and the various ways in which the built environment has a profound impact on human health. She realized her naturopathic, nutritional, and herbal toolkit were only as useful as her environment was healthy. Amie's now on a mission to raise awareness on a commonly overlooked but monumentally significant influence on health and well-being. And as a long-time health and wellness geek myself, I know the importance of looking at health holistically, and that includes a healthy home environment. And Amie is a wealth of knowledge, experience, and inspiration in this area. And I feel like not enough people are talking about this in the tiny house space. So I invited Amie onto the show to shout this message from the rooftops to educate tiny houses, tiny building companies, and everyone in between. This is an especially important topic in a small space like a tiny home. And in this conversation, we talk about Amie's story of mold-related illness and common signs and symptoms of mold exposure, the types of toxic mold and what a building biologist is. We also talked about mold prevention and considerations when it comes to the construction of a tiny home from scratch for DIY builders and tiny building companies, what to check for when it comes to mold detection and buying a pre-loved tiny home, the most mold-prone building materials, and which materials are better options to avoid water damage and mold growth, and so much more. Now, there's a common question that often comes up around cleaning visible mold. And even though I didn't get a chance to go deeper into this with Amie on the show, I asked her later what she would say about the common recommendations in the natural health world and the tiny house space around using clove and other essential oils, as well as the mainstream recommendation of using bleach. And if you want to know Amie's thoughts on this, I've put it all in the episode show notes, which you can find at tinyhouseconversations.com/028. Now, with all that being said, on to this tiny house conversation with Amie. Amie, thanks so much for joining me on Tiny House Conversations. It's so great to have you here on the show.
Thank you, Lucy. I am so excited to be talking to you. I'm so fascinated with tiny homes and to be talking about what we're going to cover today through that lens. This is a first for me, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh, I love that it's the first. It's an honor to have you here then, even more. So Amie, as a naturopath and many other things may be too long to name, yeah. I know that you have an interesting story which perhaps was not so fun at the time for you, and it's around mold and mold-related illness. And it's also where you discover the world of building biology. And, what I'd love to do in the conversation today is just hear a bit about your story and your experiences with mold, and then, dive a bit more into mold and building biology, as well as maybe some considerations and measures that people can take to prevent and mold-proof their home, especially in a smaller space like a tiny house, because as well as having longevity and structural integrity of our homes, it's so important to have this healthy home environment also for our physical, mental, and emotional wellness too. So can you start by sharing with us a bit about your background and then your personal experiences with mold and how it impacted your health?
So I've been a functional medicine practitioner now for over 20 years. And it was 5 years ago now, actually 2017, that I had a really extreme experience of toxic mold exposure. So up until that point, I'd been really healthy. I'm a nutritionist, naturopath, herbalist. I'd lived my best life ever since I studied, which I started at 19, and had enjoyed really good health up until that point. I had my own things to sort of deal with. I specialized in skin because I'd had acne as a result of PCOS and, that sort of thing, but had healed all of those things naturally. And as a naturopath, we're taught to look for the root cause of someone's health issues. And sometimes, more often than not, there's more than one. But there was a huge blind spot that I discovered the hard way as far as how the built environment, meaning the home that you live in or the office that you work in or the buildings that you frequent or spend a lot of time in, can really influence your health. And gosh, it was such a rude and terrifying shock to become so completely and utterly unwell and incapacitated, and to initially not know what was causing it and what was happening, and also for it to be so unresponsive to the things that I would ordinarily use. So basically, I took a career break. I had a year off, intended to take a year off to write a book, create a skincare line, write a program all about getting clear skin naturally, because that was the thing that I was just most passionate about at the time. And because of that, I moved away from the area that I'd lived in for a long time to the northern beaches of Sydney. Now, Sydney is notoriously moldy anyway, northern beaches even more so. But the house that we had moved into, or the apartment, was actually okay when we first moved in. However, as a result of the renovation that had been done just prior to us moving in, it had a leaking shower. So every time my now hubby and I were showering, the water was actually spreading underneath the carpet throughout the apartment. And the reason that wasn't obvious to us at the time was we had a north-facing apartment. It was full of sun, full of fresh air. We always had the windows open. And so it never got wet to the point where we actually registered it, except for one time when I was like, this feels damp. But, being by the ocean in Manly, I thought, could be just, sea spray. So I moved in, it was November 2016. And over summer, I had a bit of a break just because I was a bit burnt out, and had committed to starting work at the beginning of February, and found when I tried to do that, I was very tired and found it very difficult to focus. And so I just want to say, I think the reason it took as long as it did for me to realize that I was becoming unwell was I was basically on holiday. And so when you're not having to work and you're not in your normal routine, those indicators are not obvious. So that was my first sign. I was like, oh, wow, I must have been so much more burnt out than I realized. That's okay. I've got a whole year. I actually had 15 months off. So I thought, that's cool. I'll just start in March and give myself another month just to do a bit of rest, but I might start doing some prepping, planning, and things like that. And then I had a styling session with a girlfriend and realized all of my clothes are really tight and I couldn't fit into half of them. And, I'd been living in a swimsuit, like shorts and a singlet. So again, I wasn't in the habit of putting on work clothes. I didn't notice that I was putting on weight at the time. And during that sort of wardrobe session, we disturbed a lot of mold spores. So from that point on, I had hay fever symptoms, was constantly taking antihistamines, which is a big red flag, and started exercising, because at that point when I realized I wasn't fitting into my clothes, I'm like, right, I need to get back into a routine. And what would happen, just for context, I had done I hate running, but a 9K fun run in the September just gone, just for, personal challenge. And I couldn't walk, more than a few hundred meters on the flat without getting out of breath. And if I did a decent workout, which, wasn't anything crazy, maybe 20 to 30 minutes of cardio or something shorter, high intensity interval training, whatever it was, I'd have to go to bed for 4 hours. And then anyway, it disintegrated really quickly from there. And the extreme end that I ended up in was I had a form of dementia. I could barely hold a conversation. My memory had no memory virtually. I sometimes didn't know where I was. I actually couldn't remember my own name at one point. I couldn't leave the house because I actually couldn't figure out how to put clothes on. Like I just didn't have the neural pathways available to do something that I'd done naturally for 37 years. And literally everything about my health went down the toilet. I put on weight. I was out of breath. My skin dried out and cracked. I had chronic allergies. I felt halfway between drunk and hungover all of the time, couldn't sleep very well, but was exhausted. So I was in bed. I had chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, gut issues. It just, literally every wheel fell off. And partly the challenge was because my brain was so impacted. If I'd gotten sick with anything else, I would have gone straight to do some research and I would have figured it out and I would have known what to do. But I couldn't even read more than a couple of sentences of anything without like forgetting what I'd read. And so I was so incredibly vulnerable. And the other issue was, in my case, and is actually often the case, the mold wasn't visible. So I think most of us, or certainly previous to this experience, I would have assumed if there was a mold issue in my home, I would have seen it or smelt it. And certainly if you see or smell mold, yes, that's an obvious indication. But in my experience since, and I've trained to be a certified mold testing technician, more often than not, and I just want to take a stab and say about 80% of the time, it's actually not obvious either. And so it really was a combination of someone sharing it online that triggered my memory about something to do with a leak at the very beginning of our tenancy that we never heard anything more about. And then from there, I was able to engage a building biologist, get an assessment, found out how terrible a state our apartment was, and then begin to sort of do something about it. But yeah, it was about a 5-month period, I think. It was around Easter. So yeah, 5 to 6 months of being in this property and having it just become increasingly more moldy. And it didn't help that I was obviously working from home too. So my exposure was a lot more than it would have been if I was just coming home from work every day and sleeping there overnight. But it got really serious really quite quickly. And yeah, fortunately, I was aware of mold illness. I had a colleague that specialized in it, and I got onto a building biologist really quickly, but it was very, very scary. And it's taken me quite some time to recover for a few reasons. But one of the big ones is we have a similar issue with water damage in Australia as the US does, which is 1 in 2 buildings have significant water damage. And the first step in recovering from this is getting to a non-water damaged building. And that, to be honest, is, I think, one of the greatest hurdles, and why I'm so passionate about talking about prevention, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. If anyone's freaking out about what I've just said, we're going to talk about how to avoid this. And also, if it happens to you, I'll point you in the right direction of who to call. But most of these things are avoidable, and often, like in my case, it was a leak from a renovation that I wasn't in control of, but oftentimes the water damage is actually from occupant behavior or a lack of awareness around managing the internal environment as it pertains to how much water vapor is produced inside or the geographic location you're in. So for instance, I now live in the Northern Rivers, which is even more humid than Sydney. So that presents a real issue for managing the environment. So that's my story, really briefly, around what happened and what that was like for me. And I guess why I'm now talking about like the unsexiest subject in the world, which is mold. I'm kind of mad at the universe that it's like made this my assignment, because it is just not inspiring, like, helping people have beautiful, radiant skin. But, I guess this is my lot in life, Lucy.
Yeah. Someone's got to do it. Someone's got to do it. And I think that, well, we've had jokes behind the scenes of you being called the mold queen as well, right? Even though you're like, it's not the most flattering topic, but I feel like there's so many things in there. Like, obviously you've been through the ringer, but maybe for a higher purpose, so that now you're able to help others that may be experiencing the same things, or helping them prevent it before it happens, and not having to go through the same challenges that you went through. So, I mean, I know that there are lots of different health practitioners talking about the mold, but I think the more that we can get this message out, and in particular, I was saying to you in the tiny house space, there's not that many people talking about this in depth, like I think what we're going to get into today. So I'm really glad that we can do that. And you mentioned a few times there as well about building biologists and building biology. So I'd love if you're able to just, if anyone hasn't heard that term before and they're not familiar, are you able to give a bit of an overview of what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't know what one was either until I needed one. So the simplest way I can explain what a building biologist is I describe them like a doctor for your home. And what that means is they come in and they assess the building. And of course, they can do this with your office or your gym or even your car. But typically it's a home, and they assess the property for sources of or triggers of illness or health hazards in the home that might affect your health and well-being. And that's not just mold, although that's a big part of it, but also EMFs, so the electroclimate of the home, whether that's wireless radiation or electric and magnetic fields. They also look at things like building materials, so the influence of the chemicals or even the properties of those building materials on your home, even your furnishings, the chemicals in your water. They can even do things like check if your home was a drug lab by doing samples. So their job is to really find or uncover any possible things in the home that might be contributing to your symptoms or health. Or sometimes people will hire them proactively to reduce any issues, to avoid getting sick from them. But certainly testing the property for mold, or more specifically water damage, is a big part of what they do. And I guess just by extension of that, to talk about that for a little bit longer, when I say, you'll hear me say water damage frequently. And the reason I do that rather than saying mold, although they're often used interchangeably, is that whenever there's water intrusion in a property that's in contact with porous materials, mold is actually just the visible proxy for all of the microorganisms that are generated when that happens. And so if you have a leak, or if you have a moisture issue in your tiny home, you've actually got all kinds of things proliferating, including mold, but also bacteria and other microorganisms that can make you sick. And because of that, that's why people can have so many different symptoms and presentations when they're exposed to water damage, because the toxic soup, if you like, can vary from place to place and depending on the building materials. So I guess just for the last little piece of context there, I'll also say mold is literally everywhere. Fungi is everywhere. They are nature's decomposers. They're designed to break down rotting and dead things. And in the context of a healthy world, that's great. But in a world where we're building homes out of materials that are very processed and not managing moisture, it becomes a source of food and liquid for these microorganisms that then just do what they're programmed to do. And there are lots of fungi in the environment that are not harmful at all. And so the goal is not to have a fungi-free home or a bacteria-free home. Indeed, sterile environments are not great for our health either. But the nature of the ecology shifts the more water that's introduced. And it's about avoiding toxic molds or molds that produce biotoxins that can make you sick. And the role of a building biologist is to, assess the fungal environment to see whether there's current water intrusion, past water intrusion, but also to find sources of water intrusion and existing water damage as well.
Yeah. And so it's interesting what you said about, so it's not just the mold and all of that. So would it be fair to say that it's the conditions that are allowing the mold to proliferate, so such as things like water damage and excess moisture and not managing the internal environment so effectively?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is, if you think about, building biologists consider the home to be your third skin and your clothing to be your second skin. And so, even the fabrics you choose to wear are important, but you're looking at the home. If you look at the home holistically, what they're really looking at is the microbiome of the home. And for anyone who's into natural health, you'll know how heavily diet and lifestyle can influence your gut microbiome. And when it comes to your home, the microbiome of the home is heavily influenced by moisture, as well as the building materials you choose, but primarily the moisture and how well you manage that or address issues. So it's not about constant cleaning, although that is definitely one aspect of reducing mold issues. But it is primarily comes down to moisture management.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you touched on there as well, you talked about toxic mold, and I know that, and you said earlier too about that it's not always visible. So are you able to go into just maybe some of the different types of mold? I know some are also not as maybe concerning as others, but which should we be concerned about when it comes to being exposed and then obviously preventing it and not having it affect our health?
So here's the tricky part is, so if you see mold, there's definitely a problem. It doesn't matter what species it turns out to be on the sample. If you have gotten to a point where you're seeing visible mold, you have a moisture problem. So I think that's probably the easiest blanket statement I could give you. That being said, yeah, essentially what you're seeing is the tip of the iceberg of the moisture problem that you have. But in terms of the species, there is really a list of the top 5 toxigenic molds as defined by a Hertz Me Too. And they're sort of considered the most dangerous molds that you can be exposed to. But everyone's different. And if you look at what like an Amie would classically look for, there are, I think, about 10 water damaged molds that we would consider to be indicative of there's a moisture problem inside this property, versus those that don't. So for anyone who's not familiar with those terms, an Amie stands for Environmental Relative Moldy Index, and it's one test of many that a building biologist might do. And it was developed by the Environmental Protection Agency, where they tested a bunch of houses in the US, admittedly, and compared the fungal ecology of homes that were considered to be healthy and not water damaged versus those that were. And you can really see the shift in certain species when we see water intrusion. So an Amie test is one way to assess a property. You will also get a Hertz Me Too score from that. It's quite expensive. They're both quite expensive. So often people will just do a Hertz Me Too to save a bit of money, and that will give you the top 5 toxigenic molds. Now, they're not the only toxigenic molds that they are that you can have in the home, but if there's water damage, reliably you can expect to see at least one of these. Now, Hertz Me Too stands for Health Effects Roster of Type-Specific Forms of Mycotoxins and Inflammagens version 2. So hence why it's called a Hertz Me Too for short. Yeah. But basically, it's the top 5 molds that we know produce mycotoxins, which are biological poisons, sometimes called biotoxins, or inflammagens, which are chemicals that trigger inflammatory responses in your body. So there's 2 species of Aspergillus on there. And those are the ones we typically see with high humidity or poorly ventilated spaces, poor ambient moisture management. And we'll talk about those in a bit more detail soon, so you know what that even means. But Then we see Willemi acebi, which is sort of the next level of water intrusion, Chitomium. And then I guess the big one, which everyone calls black mold, which is not quite the right name for it because molds can be any color depending on the substrate they're growing on, but Stachybotrys. So that's the one that's considered to be, the most deadly. Yeah, those are the ones that we're sort of worried about. Whereas, when we're looking at a healthy home, of course, it's normal to see other species of mold in the home, and they're not necessarily harmful in any way, but it just tells a story about the microbiome of that space and how well moisture has been managed. And if there's been a leak, often that will be revealed on a test like this.
You've mentioned like a few times moisture and water damage and all that. So I'm wondering if we can go further into just what are some of the mold-prone aspects of a home environment or a building, or even if someone's at an office as well.
It's kind of 3 primary ways that you can end up with a water-damaged building or property or tiny home. And there's sort of 3 general grades of water intrusion. So the first one is humidity or moisture vapor. And so you've got internal and external sources here. You've got outdoor humidity. So there are definitely parts of Australia and, of course, all around the world that are prone to either wet seasons or humid environments like tropics, subtropics. And I guess I should actually spell out the ideal indoor humidity is between 45 to 55% for health reasons for humans. That is the sweet spot between not being too dry but not being too damp for our biology to function optimally. And anything sort of 60% and above, as far as relative humidity goes, we start to see issues that are going to compromise human health. So, for example, at 60%, we start to see dust mites proliferating. And from 66%, we start to see aspergillus growing. And then, 70% upwards, other molds will start to join the party. And essentially, we get mold growing after 48 hours of excess moisture. So it doesn't take long. And this can make going away on holiday or leaving a place closed up for some time risky. And there are things you can obviously do to mitigate that. But basically, outdoor humidity. And one of the challenges around that is most people think, we just need to open the windows more. But if it's humid outside, you're just allowing that moisture to come inside and make the inside of your property wet or damp. On top of that, though, you have the challenges of moisture vapor that us as human beings produce as a result of sweating and breathing, and then the things that we do inside our homes like cooking, showering, and cleaning. So it's estimated that each individual can produce up to 10 litres a day between cooking, showering, cleaning, sweating, breathing. And that's a lot of moisture that can remain trapped inside your home if it's not well ventilated, and or the membrane of the home is not breathable. And unfortunately, we're seeing an alarming trend with energy efficient style homes where they're trying to seal the home so tightly that it actually doesn't allow the building to breathe, and you're going to create mold problems. In fact, a study that was done somewhat recently found there was mold in, I think, up to 85% of new builds, and certainly 45% within the first year after they'd been built. And this is partly due to building practices, which is unfortunate because people just follow the building code and think that, these things are best practice, but also because most people, including myself, prior to training as a mold testing technician, weren't taught. So in a tiny home, depending on the design, you may not have the issues with laundry. So you might have an external laundry, or you might be located somewhere where you do your laundry off-site. But most tiny homes that I've seen anyway, which is not a whole lot, I'm not an expert, but usually we'll have a shower, a basin, and a small kitchen. So you've got the steam from the shower, a little bit of steam from running hot water in the tap, steam from cooking. And if you've got a dishwasher, maybe some steam escaping from that as well, that needs to be managed. And we'll talk about how to manage that in a minute. But that's sort of the basic entry level moisture intrusion that everyone has to deal with on a daily basis. And then we have less frequent events, but those are things like leaks. So you might have a roof leak, you might have a pipe burst, maybe the gasket in the sink in the kitchen's come loose from, bringing things in and out of the cupboard, and you've developed a slow leak in there. So typically you'll find those a lot quicker because, the water leak will generally present itself a lot quicker, but because there's a lot higher volume of water, it also means the species of mold that can proliferate can be more problematic as well. And then the last ones, of course, are more extreme weather events like flooding. I'm in the northern rivers, and we had horrific floods at the end of February and again in March, and it's going to take years for the region to recover. But certainly in terms of where you locate your tiny home, that is going to have a huge influence on, whether you're at risk of flooding or not. And so I would encourage you to think really carefully about the site that you're going to put your place on. Now, I know sometimes your options are a bit limited, but those things would also go a long way to preventing you from losing your tiny home or having it damaged to the point where it's uninhabitable. So that are kind of the three key things to look out for. Now, obviously, flooding and major events like that are outside of our control. And so we'll just park that in hopefully it'll never happen to you. Choose your site carefully, do your research carefully to avoid increasing the risk of that being the case. But the other two things, I just want to run through what you can do to sort of monitor and manage those things. So as far as leaks go, what you want to do is have a maintenance schedule for your tiny home. And thankfully, because it's a tiny home, it'll be far less laborious than a standard sized home. But the things you want to be looking for are checking the roof. Now, depending on what the roof's made out of, that might look like different things. But if it's say a ColourBond roof and it's been screwed in, you want to be making sure there's no tiny amounts of water coming through into the roof space. So you might use a moisture meter for that and just do regular checks to make sure, especially after a heavy rain. If you have guttering on your tiny home, making sure that that remains clear, always cleaning it out of debris, leaf litter, twigs, dirt, dust, grime, because in a heavy rain, they need to be clear in order to be able to drain the water away efficiently. And then wherever you have wet spaces or where you have water coming into and leaving the tiny home, you want to have regular checks there as well. So, if you clean the house once a week, you would no doubt be looking inside the bathroom cabinetry and the kitchen cabinetry. If you have a dish drawer in there, checking under that would be important. And also I'd be checking underneath the tiny home as well, under where the shower basin sits, to just see, check that there isn't water coming through. The other thing I would do is I would use the moisture meter to check the building materials. So let's say your shower cavity butts up against like a lounge wall, for instance, you would use that moisture meter to check there's no moisture coming through, like that nothing's happened to the waterproof membrane and that it's coming through to whatever you've used to build the wall on the other side. So regularly checking those things would be important. And one thing especially to be mindful of is braided water hoses are probably the most common water inlet pipes that are being used now, because they allow for more design aesthetics to be explored. And certainly in the case for tiny home, it's much easier to supply water with a soft hose than a hard one in tiny spaces. But they are notorious for leaking. They have a lifespan of 5 to 7 years. So I would be replacing them every 4 or 5 years and keeping an eye on them. They're notorious for generating pinprick leaks. So it might start with just a cupboard that feels a bit damp or like humid when you open it, or mold growing on your things inside. So be very watchful for that. And then the last thing, which is probably the thing you've got to be on top of on a daily basis, is what is the relative humidity inside the home. And with a tiny home, fortunately, you'll only need probably one thermohygrometer. If you've got a larger style one, maybe two. A thermohygrometer, and I'll share a link with you, Lucy, so people can check that out. They're just a cheap battery-operated LED display that shows the temperature and also the relative humidity in that particular space. It's a very tiny weather sensor. And this will allow you to eyeball it at any time of the day and check that it's sitting between 45 and 55%. I've just looked at mine now and it's 62%, so getting a bit high, which means, once I'm finished chatting with you, I'll either put the dehumidifier on or open the window. And this is where having an outdoor sensor would also be helpful, because which one do you do? Now, it's wintertime here in the Northern Rivers of Australia, and the humidity has finally dropped from like 70, 80, 90% down to actually pretty dry. It was 35% the other day. So in all likelihood, it's going to be drier outside, in which case I'm going to open the sliding door, open the windows, and let the moisture drift out of the property. However, if it's over like 65% outside, you're only going to let more moisture in. And that's when you want to close up the property and turn on the dehumidifier. So I'd be looking at a smaller dehumidifier for the space. You could probably get away with a 2-in-1 with an air purifier, actually, because the cubic meterage in the space is so much smaller than a standard house. But you'll want to run that dehumidifier to bring the humidity down. Again, thankfully, because the volume of air that you're trying to dry is small, that'll probably happen really quickly, like maybe in less than half an hour as opposed to hours. But the tricky thing is, if you are trying to use that space, it will probably get quite warm. So you'll need to think about how you manage the temperature and things like that too. But it is as simple as that. Keep an eye on the humidity, dry the property down if you need to. Now, if the humidity is lower outside, as I mentioned, open the door, open the windows. And if it's raining outside, that, the moisture is at 99%, then keep everything closed. That being said, I know we're not going to talk about air quality more broadly so much in this episode, but you do need several fresh air exchanges in a home to keep it healthy, especially if you've got a new tiny home or it's been built in the last 1 to 2 years. Depending on the materials you've used, they'll be off-gassing into the airspace. So you will have to sort of open everything up 2 to 3 times a day to get a full fresh air exchange in there, and then dry it back down if necessary. So I know it must sound like a lot now that I've just said that out loud, but it is a bit like a habit, like brushing your teeth. Just keeping an eye on the humidity every day. And when you do your weekly clean, just double checking that, everything is still dry in the wet areas. And, in doing so, you will be able to prevent almost any mold issue that you could possibly have. The only time that you may not be able to do that is if your leak is very slow and in a place that's really difficult to identify. So let's say it's a roof leak and it's being caught in the sarking. If you have used sarking, it might take some time for that moisture to show up, and it may even kind of dribble down into the wall cavities, and it might show up on the floor space first. Or if there's, the screws that are holding the roof onto the frame, the silicon's perished at all, that might be just a very, very slow drip, in which case you might have to look out for other signs of mold or moisture that might not be as obvious. In fact, Lucy, I might even share with you, I've got a link to a free webinar, the 7 sneaky signs that your house has mold, even if you can't see it. And only because for time, I don't want to go through them now, but there are different things that are red flags for a moisture problem that might be really helpful.
That would be great. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Put that in the show notes.
Yeah. Just to pick it up earlier than, actually having visible mold. But it really is as simple as that. Now, if you have a leak or you get flooded, if you have a tiny home that has, a dishwasher or a washing machine in it, and there's a leak or a flood, the trick is to get those building materials completely dry in 48 hours, and then you won't have a mold problem. So again, this is where having a moisture meter and a dehumidifier comes into play, because you can use the moisture meter to keep checking. You can use the dehumidifier to vacuum up the moisture from the air. And then you will also know, like if there are elements that are still not completely dry after 48 hours, you just cut out those little bits and replace them. And you don't have to strip your whole home and start from scratch. So even though it's another habit to include in your daily and weekly, I guess, house maintenance, it really will pay dividends down the line with, preventing loss. And, as you said, it's not just about structural issues or aesthetic issues. It's literally your health that's on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And, while it can seem like there is a lot to consider, I think also maybe one of the benefits, even though you are in a smaller space, and that can be having a smaller space to have the exposure. But then on the other hand, when you're talking about like checking for that there's no water damage and excess moisture build up, that in a tiny space, it wouldn't take you as long to have to do that. And I also love how you talked about before picking the site that you're on so that you can really prevent being in an environment that's going to be conducive to that, the moisture and the buildup of mold and all of that. Because for me, actually, it's interesting to talk about the northern rivers, because I actually had an opportunity to park my tiny house on a friend's 100-acre property up in Mullum. And I decided about 6 weeks ago that I wasn't going to do that because of everything that we're talking about today. And I think that's such a I was like, I don't think that it's a good idea to put my tiny in an environment that's like this at the moment, with all the stuff that's happened with the floods. Yeah. So I love that you said that, because I think that's maybe one of the most important things to consider overall, because maybe your outside environment outside the home is also just as important. So, and, many of my listeners are either looking at DIY building their own tiny home from scratch, or they're having one built for them by a professional builder. So I'd love if you're able to share with us just some important considerations for preventing mold when it comes to the construction of a home from scratch.
This is such a great question. And this is obviously an ideal way to do it if you can go from scratch, because then you know the history of the property. You never know if you're getting something secondhand, what's occurred in the space prior to your ownership. There are certainly things you can do to help clean up a pre-owned property. But if I was building one from scratch, there are definitely a few things that I would want to include. So one of them would be to ensure that you have windows on every wall and for every sort of space in the home. So let's say the bedroom is built above the bathroom, you'll want an opportunity to be able to ventilate the bedroom upstairs, but also the bathroom downstairs. And what this does is it allows you to open up every single side. So no matter which way the prevailing wind is going that day, you can get good cross flow ventilation, which means you can air out the property really easily. Because although a tiny home is movable, once you've got somewhere that you really like, you're not going to keep moving it around to, take advantage of the sun or the breeze. So you want to set it up so that it's, as easy as possible to take advantage of whichever way the breeze is going. Second of all, you want to ensure that all of your materials have a similar R value. And what I mean by that is an R value is a number that's given to describe how well a material insulates a space. And I know, budget constraints, you might not be able to do all of the things I'm going to suggest, but when you pick, really good insulation for the walls, for example, but then you just do single pane glass, your overall insulation result is reduced to the weakest link, which is the single pane glass. So getting windows with a thermal break or double glazing would also be really helpful. And that sort of prevents condensation, which prevents, moisture collecting in wall cavities or roof cavities as well, where you can't really see it or do much about it. Obviously, also try and have it set up so you can get as much light as possible. Now, this is a bit of a balancing act with privacy, of course, and window coverings and all of those kinds of things. But to be able to open windows and let actual sunlight come in, because the UVB rays are disinfecting, would also be really wise. The second thing I would say is consider your building materials really carefully. And again, I know this comes down to, the kind of finished result that you want and also the overall budget of the project. But a lot of building materials can be quite harmful for health in terms of heavy metals and glues and formaldehyde, cancer-causing chemicals. And when you're sleeping in a space and inhaling it, that can cause some really significant issues, but also how their hygroscopic ability to absorb water and then release it, as opposed to having condensation form on it. So what I mean by that is natural finishes are definitely a much better choice and will allow you to do less to manage the moisture. So wood, of course, is always the dream. Hardwood floors or natural timber framing, natural timber benches, fixtures, finishes, things like that, avoiding metal and stone, although stone can be used as a thermal mass, which can help to heat and cool the property as well, depending on how you orient it. I would definitely work with a building biologist who's trained in healthy home design if you're interested in those elements. But yeah, anything like, for flooring, a cheaper and just as effective alternative is bamboo. Just make sure you're going for pressed boards, not glued boards, to avoid the chemicals. There's a great bamboo sort of tongue and groove you can just clip in. Again, consider the underlay and how it's being adhered to the floor. Then for walls, cedar wood or even just any timber would be better than plasterboard. But if you're just going to use plasterboard, consider things like cedar wood in wet areas. So in the bathroom, something like that would be able to absorb some of the steam and then gently release it through the day while you've got the window open, as opposed to forming condensation, on the walls. Alternatively, you could just tile the whole bathroom and then squeegee it and towel it dry afterwards. But it depends, how much time and energy you have to actively keep the home healthy, or whether you've got the budget to allow your building materials to do the heavy lifting for you. The other thing you could also consider, and this is getting really fancy, but if you had a split system built in, because aircon actually has a natural dehumidifying action, and most split systems will have a dry mode. And the wonderful thing about that is you can use it. It doesn't work as well in a standard size house just because of the space you're trying to dry down, but in a tiny home, it would be perfect. And you would be able to dry the space down without the heat that gets created from a dehumidifier. And then you could also access the heating and cooling elements of it as well as one unit. So, that's something that I would, if I was to design a tiny home, would absolutely put in place. The other thing that I would recommend is with bathrooms and wet areas, I would go for those traditional, I know they're a bit old-fashioned, but the shower basins rather than sort of tiles and grout and waterproof membranes, because those things degrade over time and again have a lifespan of maybe 7 to 10 years. So unless you're prepared to budget for gutting and redoing your bathroom every 7 to 10 years, you'll get more longevity by using like a proper plastic basin. And yeah, I'd consider, tiling the walls or having it like as a proper wet room as opposed to plasterboard, which is just going to absorb moisture and grow mold. There's one other thing I was going to say there, and it slipped my mind. If it comes back to me, I'll drop it in. But they're the big ones that I would be thinking about in a space like that in order to sort of protect the home. Now, yeah, the other thing I was going to say is if the budget allows for it, I would encourage you to have exhaust fans in the kitchen and the bathroom area that vent to the outside of the tiny home. And that way, if you're cooking and it's producing a lot of steam, you can just run the range hood and it will vacuum it outside. And so again, less work for you to do to dry down the interior after cooking. And same with the bathroom, when you're showering, you can obviously have the windows open, but it's more of a passive escaping of the steam, whereas an exhaust fan will actually be extracting it out of the bathroom and putting it outside. So yeah, that would be my top tips when designing one from scratch.
And so you mentioned timber there as maybe a preference and different things that you can do, the different finishes and stuff. And then you also said that metal and stone are probably not a great option. I'm wondering, though, you mentioned also before about color bond on the roof. So I know a lot of tiny house people, and actually it's quite common for tiny house builders to use color bond as the external cladding because it is quite lightweight and for other reasons too. So I'm wondering your thoughts on color bond in general as well, from this perspective.
Yeah, so it's always a balancing act about your priorities and maybe the climate that you're building for and your goals and your budget. But I would also say color bond is a good option. It's becoming a more popular recommendation for building biologists and standard homes, as well as a reflector of wireless radiation from the external environment. And I know we're going to have another chat on EMF, so I won't go down that rabbit hole, but yeah, it is lightweight. It is, even though there's a lot of embodied energy in steel, it is recyclable. It has great longevity. It's the ideal choice if you are capturing rainwater for use as well, as opposed to using a tiled roof. So I would still recommend that. The thing is, when warm moisture vapor contacts cold materials like stone and steel, it's very prone to forming condensation. So I'm just thinking about, winter time, for example, and it's cold outside and you're inside and you've got breath vapor and it's rising and hitting the steel. It can form condensation, which is why sarking is quite important to sort of capture that and prevent that. Good insulation will also prevent that. And obviously good moisture management will also go a long way to reducing that risk. But it's just, aluminium window frames, which again, very commonly used. It's not to say don't use them, but if you're using them, that's a risk area that you have to constantly be monitoring. So this is why having a thermal break or double glazing can be good. And then just wiping down condensation as it forms and using the dehumidifier or dry mode to prevent it from even forming would be good. Everything comes with a risk, a pro, a con. And that's one of the challenges with that. So, even if you've got external metal cladding the whole way around, then I'd just be very mindful of the waterproof membrane wrap that's being used. Make sure it's semi-permeable in that it doesn't allow moisture to come in, but does allow moisture to leave so that the building can breathe a little better.
Yeah. Okay, cool. That's really good to know. Thank you for that. And, we have talked about what people can do if they're constructing a home from scratch, but there are also some of my listeners thinking of looking into buying a pre-loved tiny home. So as we said, maybe someone else's, it was designed for someone else and they've lived in it before. So I know you mentioned before, you don't know the history of that home and what's been in the environment and all of that. But if someone is literally going to inspect a pre-loved tiny home that they're thinking about buying, obviously you don't have a whole heap of time, and maybe, bringing in a building biologist and all of that kind of stuff is not necessarily realistic, at least initially. But what are just a few little things that people can check, when they're going to inspect a pre-loved tiny home?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about my course at the end of this episode, but I might just mention that one of the bonuses in there actually teaches you how to inspect a property, depending on whether you're going to rent it or buy it. Now, it's obviously a bit of a tricky area with tiny homes because you've got the same sort of competition and time constraints as rentals. So even if you're buying it, you don't tend to have you can't take the same liberties as if you're buying a standard house. But basically, if it's been well maintained, versus you can see either the guttering's in disrepair, there's rust on the roof, it's dirty on the roof. You can see there's degraded building materials. That's always a bit of a red flag. If anything smells at all, like if a place is truly healthy, it should smell like nothing but fresh air. I don't know if they do this with tiny home inspections, but I know whenever I was inspecting a rental, you knew it was bad if the agents were burning a scented candle.
Oh, no.
Or if they've got like reed diffusers or like they're covering up some kind of smell. Also, the quality of the air, like if the place is a bit damp, the sensation of the air on your skin will feel different to when you're outside it. So if it's hot, like it's summertime, you'll go in there and it'll feel stuffy. It'll feel, and they'll probably have the windows open, and obviously it'll be presented in the best light possible, but the air quality will feel a bit stuffy. Now, the reverse is true. If it's cold, like in wintertime, you'll feel a bit damp on the skin. It'll feel a bit dank. So yeah, how the air quality feels and any odors, obviously check. Also the obvious places for water damage. So open the cupboard under the sink in the kitchen, check under the dishwasher if there is one, check under the washing machine if there is one, and behind it. So take a torch with you, take a moisture meter with you. I would also look, like in the bathroom, look at the ceiling and see if there's any bubbling or water stains or marks. Same with on the ceiling of the general place as well. And, if it's been given a fresh coat of paint, just ask yourself, was there something that they're covering up? And you can also run like a Hurts Me Too test as well. So most of the time there's going to be, once you know what to look for and test for, you'll be able to rule out a secondhand tiny home pretty easily. But if you get in there, you're not finding anything, nothing is sort of hitting your radar, you can also take dust samples with a Swiffer cloth and run a Hurts Me Too. Now, I'd only do that if it looked perfect in every other way. And then you can send that off for testing and actually find out, whether if it's had water damage based on what you find. So I teach you how to do all of that in the training that I've got. But yes, there's so much you can do to avoid buying a lemon. To put it briefly.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that. Because I think it is always good to just have those little things that to look out for. And I know for me, smell is always one of the first things that I consider and can recognize. And thank you. And obviously we're talking about prevention here as much as possible. Ideally, we do that. But what if, just say someone's already living in their tiny home, and whether they've constructed it or had it built for them, or they've bought a pre-loved one, they haven't really considered mold prevention before, and then they do have some water damage in their home. When would it be completely necessary to remediate either the area of the home or any of your clothing or personal items, or even replacing parts of the home? When is that most, or even relocating if it comes to that?
So in terms of like when you might need to remediate, that would really be based on a couple of things. So first of all, have you found a leak, and is it fresh or not? So if it's a new leak where you found some moisture intrusion and it's kind of new and under 48 hours and you can get it dry yourself, that's fine. You won't have to do anything more than that. But is it something that you think, oh my gosh, that's clearly been happening for a long time? Like with mold, you need to remove it rather than clean it. So let's say you've had a slow leak in the roof and you didn't pick it up. And then over time, you've finally seen a water stain coming through, or maybe noticed the paint bubbling a bit and realized there's mold coming through. There's a very specific way to remove, I guess, water damaged materials so you don't contaminate the rest of the home. It does have to be done under containment. But in the simplest terms, it would involve cutting out the moldy bit and a meter all around it. So does that mean you've got to replace your entire ceiling? No. Does it mean you've got to gut the whole house and start again? Not necessarily, especially if it's been, trapped up between that building material and the exterior cladding. But if you're seeing mold coming through, that's definitely an issue. And if you think it's been going for a while, that's definitely an issue. If you're having health issues, depending on the nature of the health issues, you may or may not need to do that. So for example, aspergillus is kind of the first genera that sort of pop up, and they'll typically create allergy type symptoms. So if you have asthma, your asthma will start getting worse, or you find you're using more medication, or you might not be an asthmatic and you have an asthma attack. That's what happened to me. You might be getting hay fever symptoms all the time, except it's not spring or it's not the season you normally get it. You're just constantly taking antihistamines, or you're getting funny rashes. So eczema, dermatitis, things like that. Now, you might find after removing that part of the ceiling, just going back to that example and then replacing it, those symptoms go away. And you might have to obviously clean your bedding and vacuum your mattress. But if your symptoms disappear, you don't need to do anything further about that. But if you've got more toxigenic molds in there that are causing things like migraines, IBS, acne, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and those things are not resolved after removing the water damage itself, you might need to do more remediation. And the other, I guess, red flag is a Hertz Me Too or an Amie test that shows there's really problematic toxigenic molds in there. And then you would want to do a deep remediation of the property then. Now, that might not mean gutting it. It might be HEPA vacuuming and microfiber wiping and then just and pulling everything out and cleaning it before it goes back in. But yeah, certainly that would be something I would engage a professional to guide you on, because I've seen two extreme sides of the coin. One, I've seen people not do enough and just remain sick. I mean, it's so heartbreaking, but this happens to me all the time when I'm seeing clients and I'm like, oh, it sounds like you're in a moldy home or you've got a mold problem. And I tell you, it's 6 to 12 months before people are willing to kind of accept that it might be that. And they'll take stuff and then they'll get worse and then they'll get sicker. And then they're finally like, oh, okay, let's have a look. And then, wow, there it is. And they've wasted a year and all this money on supplements and things like that. So I don't want that to be anyone's experience. But on the same thread, I've seen people do the extreme other version, which is they've just completely gutted the place and burned all of their things and started from scratch. And look, that is necessary sometimes, but more often than not, there's a middle ground where you can achieve the result of bringing your tiny home back to appropriate healthy fungal ecology, and you can restore your health in that space. Now, I will just say this just to be thorough. Sometimes, and this happens in standard homes a lot, the home that makes you sick, no level of remediation, can often bring that home back to a state of health. Now, I feel like statistically speaking, it would be a lot less in a tiny home because there's a lot less things to do to fix it up. But the toxins or the chemicals mold produces adhere and absorb onto stuff, less so on metal and stone. So, a metal external cladding would be easier to remediate than, say, weatherboards or something like that. But sometimes I find people have to sort of remediate the place, sell it, and move on to a new one, which is, it's not too common, but it does happen. So I'm putting that in there just because if someone has been in a tiny home that's been really water damaged and they're really sick and they do all of the remediation and don't get better, sometimes it's just because that place just isn't going to ever be clean enough for you to thrive in again.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me of when we're thinking about our health and wellness, that it's not just what you mentioned before, nutrition and movement and all of that there's this epigenetic factor as well. It's your environment, and it's and your home is somewhere that I guess most of us will spend quite a lot of time in. So it's so important to get this right and to prevent and do it as much as we can to not only look after our, nutrition and movement and other lifestyle aspects, but the environment is so important. And, you touched on some of those different symptoms and things that can happen. And I know that, like a lot of things in health and wellness, so people can react differently to mold, and that the symptoms can be similar to other things as well. And it's like, how do you know if it's the mold, or is it something else, or is it a combination of things? And you have talked about testing and different little things that you can do. What about, do you have any more to say on that? I suppose, like, if someone's like, I don't know if it is mold or if it's something else, like what can you say about that?
So there's a couple of aspects to investigating, what's underneath those symptoms. And one of them, of course, is other things that we talked about. Like, does your home have signs and symptoms of a moisture problem, in which case you still have a problem to fix, even if it's not the thing that's making you unwell. But even if it's not the thing that's making you unwell, living or working in a water damaged building will inhibit your healing. For example, mold produces chemicals to kill off bacteria, so it gets the food and water, and those things are antibiotic in nature. And so you're inhaling, ingesting, and absorbing antibiotics chronically from the space, which of course wrecks your gut flora, which will give you IBS, will, affect your skin health, all kinds of things, make you more prone to things like thrush or UTIs. And whilst it might not be the root cause, it might get in the way of you from recovering those things, or your supplements or your medications from working. The other thing is there's a few other investigations to consider. First of all, the first thing I usually order for people is the HLA or haplotype testing. So do you have the mold gene or not? And there are several different haplotypes. So it's not sort of a single, genetic hand of cards, but essentially 25% of the population, it may be as high as 33%, have a genetic makeup where, and I'm one of them, so I'm going to say where our immune system can't tag mycotoxins for elimination like other toxins in our body. And so they build up in our system and then chronically trigger an immune reaction that generates a lot of inflammation in the body. So this would determine also the degree of remediation that you need. So if you don't have the mold gene, your body can generally metabolize biotoxins quite well. You don't have to go to the same lengths as someone like if it was me in the same situation who would have to just be remediating to the nth degree. So that's really helpful to sort of guide how far you got to go, and also how much support you need with recovery from mold. Another test, I don't usually do this test, to be honest, because it's often very obvious to me what's going on, but you can do a urinary mycotoxin test. So it's testing your urine for mold toxins. Now, the tricky thing about this is it doesn't tell us where you're getting exposed. So if you go to work at an office, who knows if it's coming from there or your home. So, maybe testing your home is a better option. It also might be coming from food. If you're not careful with food, you can end up with mycotoxins in food. Another one, though, is there are very specific inflammatory markers that are triggered from mold exposure, especially if you have the mold gene. And each one of them sort of sets off a specific set of symptoms. So, for example, transforming growth factor beta 1, that's a mouthful, is one of the biomarkers that gets triggered, and it causes an asthma-like syndrome and tremor. And for me, it was like I could feel all of my nerves on fire. It was like they were vibrating. It was like I was kind of plugged into the electricity grid. And it was what was causing my shortness of breath. It can actually cause fibrosis in the lungs long term and pulmonary disease. But it was why I was kind of wheezing and puffing when I was just walking, because the oxygen transfer over my lung tissue wasn't functioning because it was thicker because of the inflammation. Also, when I was checked for asthma at the doctor's, my breathing was worse after Ventolin. So, that like if someone said, these are my symptoms, you could just test that one biomarker. The thing is, if you test all of them, it's thousands of dollars. So I try and get a bit more specific with people and I base it on their symptoms. So there are different tests you can kind of look at and go, yes, I'm being exposed to mold. Yes, my immune system is having a reaction that we know is typical of mycotoxin exposure. And therefore it's something that needs to be treated. And look, I've got to say, and I never thought I would say this, but as a functional medicine practitioner who knows how important diet and lifestyle and nutrition and all of those things are in the health of your environment, you cannot out ninja your environment with vitamins, herbs, and lifestyle and mindset. And I have to say, really reluctantly, I feel like environmental health is actually more important than any one of those things. And so this would be, if you had to sort of prioritize where to start, cleaning up your environment would be the place to go. Now, to give you a bit of a real life example of how this applies in my life. So the mold gene is actually the celiac gene, and being gluten intolerant is one of the biggest red flags that you have the mold gene. Same with having a reaction to penicillin, because penicillin's a mycotoxin. But my ability to tolerate gluten is actually pretty good if I'm not being exposed to mold. It starts to impact me when I'm being exposed to mold. And so things like food intolerances and autoimmune disease all improve when you have a healthy microbiome externally, as in your environment, as well as internally. So yeah, it definitely, for me, I think, I don't want to say it's more important than diet and lifestyle, because they're all so important. But when it comes to the influence of those things on someone's health, and this is what happened to me, 37, I had the best diet, the best lifestyle. I took all my vitamins and none of it did anything for me in the face of mold exposure. The good news is, and just to give you a happy ending as we're coming to the end of the show, is that once I finally found a healthy home to live in, and that took, gosh, I think that took maybe 18 months. It's a long time. And we went from bad to worse initially. Within 6 weeks of being in this new space, I was 85% better on the vitamins, herbs, and the other interventions that I was using. So I'm sharing that with you just because I think it really illustrates just how influential the environment is, and maybe why, if you're finding, interventions that you're going through for whatever you're dealing with, whether it's a pharmaceutical medication or whatever, doesn't seem to be having the result that you want, there's a very good chance it's actually not because you haven't found the right drug or the right herb, or you're not exercising enough or eating well enough. It might actually be that your environment is holding you back, and that the key to your optimal health is actually starting with cleaning up the environment.
I love that you said that. And I couldn't agree more. I think that it is quite underrated to talk about the health of our environment. I know there's a lot of people doing it, but I think more people need to know about this. And it made me also think about, you talked about gluten intolerance, and that if you're not exposed to mold, that you seem to be able to tolerate it a bit better. So there does seem to be this kind of synergistic thing that happens with where the environment that we're in versus what we might be doing day to day and the other lifestyle things. And then it also reminded me of, talking about functional medicine several times, and you being a practitioner for so many years is finding that root cause. Like you said, you could have the best diet, the best lifestyle, and you could be doing all of the things seemingly. But if you're not getting to the root cause of what it could be, and very potentially it could be something in your environment, then it's a harder road. And so I love all that you shared today. And I feel like I could talk to you about this stuff for hours, because I know we're only scratching the surface on this topic. It's a very big topic. But I also know that you have your course, Mould-Proof Your Home. So are you able to share with us a bit more about that, and maybe who it's best for as well?
So Mould-Proof Your Home, my God, it's everything I wish that I had known before I got sick, and to avoid getting sick. So there's a few different elements to it. The first part and the biggest part is preventing mold at home. I know we've given you some general principles and guidelines here, but I go into it in a lot more detail about how to use the tools, where to use them, why to use them, when to use them, specific danger areas and what to do there, and also how best to dry up a leak or any other kind of water intrusion. That being said, people tend to get into contact with me once there's already a problem. And so there's also a whole other module on, all right, what to do, who to call, who not to call when it comes to getting your property assessed, getting it remediated properly, what that looks like, the kind of guidelines that are used. And this is so that people feel supported, whether they engage a professional or if they're in a position where they have to do it themselves, they have access to the right resources to do it in a way that will A, work, but B, won't compromise their health and home in the process. I've also got a big section there around the health effects. And the reason I've included that is water damaged buildings can cause so many different types of health issues, and it's really not something that's well understood or recognized in the allopathic medicine space. And honestly, even in the naturopathic medicine space, I think functional medicine practitioners are a lot more aware of mold, but I still see a lot of bad advice being given on how to clean up mold and also how to treat it. And this is to really support people to understand, first of all, validate what they're going through so that they actually feel understood, but for them to also recognize the ways in which mold can make you sick and therefore the right pathways out of the illness. This also has, scientific papers to support people. One of the things that I did for quite some time was helping people with the tribunal for breaking leases and getting compensation where landlords have not fixed, leaking roofs and things like that. So, the evidence is in there if you need it to share with your doctor to, illustrate that your breathing issues absolutely can be caused by mold. I mean, I had a client who was in, an apartment that was not particularly well constructed by one of the most largest and well-known Australian builders. And we were able to break the lease and get compensation, but his baby was having trouble with breathing and sinus and respiratory stuff. And they went and saw a respiratory professor at the RPA who said that wasn't possible. And I had 23 papers that illustrates exactly how it works. And so it's, no one can know everything. So this isn't a big deal in the sense that you're going to come across physicians that have no idea. I came across them as well on my journey, but this will allow you to kind of, frog leap ahead in the treatment plan if you can actually speed up that conversation with your clinician. And I think probably the thing in there I'm most excited about is one of the bonuses where I teach you how to inspect a place, whether you're looking to rent it or to buy it. There's a bit extra things you can do if you're buying a home, which may or may not be applicable to the tiny home space, but it'll allow you to really identify, once you know what you're looking for, it can actually be a lot easier than you think to avoid buying something that would potentially make you sick. So I'm really excited about it. It's a one-stop shop for everything that I feel like people need to know about mold. But the thing about it is you get lifetime access, and any upgrades, you'll get those too. But the reason that's important is twofold. You could come and see me as a client and I could tell you these things, but that would be a very expensive way of learning that information. Number two, it's a lot of information to take in a single conversation. And in all likelihood, you probably won't remember it. So this way you can go back and double check. And I can tell you with the memory issues I had when I was really unwell, my memory was like an absolute sieve, which was horrifying to me because my memory had previously been pretty darn excellent. So yeah, I'm really proud of it. And I know it's going to be so helpful. And most importantly, for every person who learns about this, their friends and family are going to have more awareness around it. And I'd like to make this illness, the nature of this illness, a thing of the past.
Absolutely. And it sounds super comprehensive, and what an amazing resource for people. And where's the best place if someone wants to check out more about the course or they want to come and sign up for it? Where's the best place that they can do that?
I will absolutely share the link with you in the show notes. But if you want to ask me any questions about it, come and join me on Instagram. My handle is Naturopath. There is a link in my bio to the course anyway, but if you've got any questions, I'd be so happy to answer them.
Perfect. Are there any final words of wisdom, just kind of put a bow on everything that we've talked about today? Anything that you'd like to leave our listeners with, Amie?
Just a couple of parting thoughts. Number one, if you've made it this far in the episode and you're not freaking out, well done. Even though it sounds really overwhelming, it is actually, the principles are really quite simple. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, most mold problems are quite preventable. And once you know how to do better and that becomes a habit, it becomes really easy. It'll become second nature. But second of all, even though the illnesses that are related to exposure to a water damaged building and the toxic soup that comes with it are, not very well understood, broadly speaking, like not a lot of practitioners are aware or understand it properly. Those that are very, very well versed and, it's thanks to a physician in the US who really sort of teased this whole immune response and, I guess, environmental poisoning apart. And there's a very well-worn path to recovery. So it's not like this mystery thing where no one knows how to help you or support you. So if you've listened to this and you are unwell and you think it's attributed to mold, or it is, and you're feeling like you're never going to get better, you absolutely will. It's just a matter of putting one foot in front of the other and taking it one step at a time. And hopefully, if you learned anything in this episode to support you to maintain your environment or improve it, then that is the very next step for you to take.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming, but knowing that, there are options out there, and that podcasts like this are hopefully designed to empower people more, and then courses like yours as well. So yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And also, Amie, thank you so much for your time today. You've been very generous with your sharings and your time. I know it's going to be valuable for a lot of people. And as I mentioned before, it's not talked enough about in the tiny house world. So thank you so much for being here with us today and for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much, Lucy. It was a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And if you're listening to us at home, make sure you stay tuned for an upcoming episode with Amie, all on electromagnetic fields, electromagnetic radiation in tiny homes. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be here with us. Stay tuned every Thursday for new episodes of Tiny House Conversations, and I'll see you next time. Thanks again for listening. And if you enjoyed the conversation today, you found it valuable, and you want to support the podcast, the best way you can do that is to share the love. That way I can keep bringing you more tiny house conversations to help you on your own tiny journey. So here are 3 ways that you can support the podcast. Number 1, if you have a friend or family member that you feel would benefit from hearing these conversations, feel free to share it with them, email them, text them, send them a telegram, do whatever you need to do to share it with them. Number 2, if you hit the subscribe button, you'll know exactly when the next episode is live. And number 3, if you head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts and leave a 5-star rating and review. Thank you so much in advance. I appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next episode.